Sometimes personalizing the question is good as you're going along. When someone's been sharing, it's often useful to use their response to invite other people to participate, right? Because that might be an opportunity for them to share about whether they had a similar experience or a similar emotion or a similar response to the text as you're going along. Ask the group members to actually make the discussion or the text personal, right? Something like, what if Jesus had asked you that question? How would you have responded, right? But be careful in personalizing the question to make sure that you're not calling someone out, right? Don't say something like, well, what if Jesus had asked you that question, Joan? Right? And here's Joan, like, struck out of the blue. Oh my gosh, I wasn't prepared for this. I don't know what to say. I'm really uncomfortable, and I'm never coming back, and I'm never answering any questions you ask ever again, right? So be careful. If you're gonna direct a question to someone specifically, know that person, have a relationship with that person. Either ask that person in advance if it's okay if you use them because you know them, you know that they can help get this conversation going. But don't just call on the new person who's their first time on the group and call them out in front of everybody and force them to actually have to say something. Okay? So it's good to personalize it, good to get people to think about how this relates to them specifically, but be careful about forcing someone to join in the conversation. Another way of guiding the questions is to, as the conversation is going, is to test for consensus. And what I mean by that is just start asking questions to find out, do we all agree about what's being said? Do we all agree that the text means what we think it means? Do we all agree that a comment or a suggestion that someone in the group made is accurate? Do we think that that's a good interpretation of the text or the question that's being asked? Once again, when doing that, it's important not to shut people down. It's important not to make people feel like, well, my response was the wrong response, right? Now, there will be times when that's necessary, right? When something is just completely unbiblical, completely inaccurate, not factually correct, right? Takes you down a slippery slope of bad theology. You want to talk about that. Right? But it's important not to call someone out and say, oh, I can't believe you said that. That's just the dumbest thing I ever heard in my life. Whatever. It's important to make sure that it's done in a loving manner in a way that doesn't prevent people from wanting to share and participate again. That's something that takes practice. I'm not one who's been known to be very tactful in the past. So it's something I've had to experience over time, that people respond differently. Luckily, I'm married, and I have a loving wife who's really good with sharp elbows and making sure that I get the message. So sometimes we have to be sort of what we call metacognitive. We have to think about what we're thinking, right, before we get into it. And so that's important, especially when you're asking questions about whether everyone agrees on that, because not everyone's going to necessarily agree. And so what do we do when we have that disagreement that takes place, right? Is it a question of doctrine where everyone has to agree? Or is it a general question of, we could go all kinds of different directions and we're just curious about what everyone's thinking? Because part of what makes discussions so great, one of the reasons why I love participating in discussions, is it's an opportunity for me to try out ideas that I'm not even sure I agree with yet. Right? That I can just sort of throw out the idea and see how it springboards amongst other people. And sometimes it's like, John, what were you thinking? That's just crazy. And I go, I know. I don't know what I'm thinking yet. That's why I'm asking the question. Right? It's the reason why I'm making these sort of statements. Group interactions are these wonderful places where we can go and kind of figure out what we believe, what we think, and practice these ideas on other people. And it helps us to kind of hone in on what it is specifically that we know that we believe. Right? So part of being a good discussion leader is allowing for those kinds of things to take place without shutting people down in the process. So testing for consensus can be fun because it helps to find out, do we have agreement amongst all of us about what this means and how this applies to our life. Which leads us to the last type of question, which is an application question. That is, what now? Is the purpose of our small group merely to disseminate information, or is it to allow Jesus to transform people's lives? Right? And I think we would all agree that it's the latter. Right? Information is great, but why should I care? Right? What's the point? Right? How does this affect my life directly? And those are some of the best questions as you start getting into the information, starting realizing that you all kind of agree on what it means. What now? Right? How do I apply this directly to my life? Nicole and I will often give homework to our group members that forces them to apply what we've already talked about during the week. Sometimes the application is so obvious you don't really need to say anything. Sometimes you need to make it more explicit. Right? In your groups that you guys have done in the past, have you done anything like this, where you've had either a formal or informal sort of application for your group members? Yeah?
Yeah.
Right?
I always end mine with so what? We've been sitting around here looking at this topic for 45 minutes. You know, the Bible says don't look in a mirror and walk away and forget what you look like. So what? What are you going to do different? You know, what's your next step? And that tends to generate a lot of different ideas, and it's actually stunning sometimes how many different ways there are to apply something that seems real simple to me. Hey, I know what I need to do, but holy cow, there are a lot of other people that have different ideas on what they need to do.
Mitch, do I need to be saying for the microphone what other people are saying, or is it strong enough to pick up conversations that happen?
If the voice is quiet, you do, but normally you don't.
Okay. And I think what Ray's saying, obviously, that the so what question, I think, is part of what we do here at the point, right? And this is when Ray teaches, it's obvious that he wants us to think about that question when we walk away, right? The so what question, and how does it apply to our lives. So I think it's good to kind of keep that as a focus in our small groups as well, so we have this sort of continuity throughout the church. Good. All right, so the first skill is to ask effective questions in being a good discussion leader. Having a set of questions prepared in advance that will lead to good discussion, hopefully get you pointed in the direction that you think the group should go. Allow that to happen. Have some guiding questions in mind. Be paying attention to where the conversation is going. Some application questions. But in order to do that and to do that well, the second skill is that you have to be effective in your listening as well. So the first skill, ask effective questions. Second skill, effective listening. It's difficult to have a good discussion if you're not listening carefully. And there's two things that you need to be listening for. The first is verbal. What are people actually saying? And this seems so obvious that I shouldn't need to say it, right? But you should actually listen to what people are talking about in your group. And you can't be a good discussion leader if you're not paying attention to what people are actually saying. But if we step back, I think we all can remember times when we were so busy thinking about what we were going to say next that we weren't actually paying attention to what people were actually saying in the moment. And this is part of that guiding questions thing, right? If we have our list of launching questions and we're so stuck on making sure our agenda is happening, we won't pay attention to what people are actually saying and allow the conversation to go in a different direction. So sometimes it's important, I think, to focus on the content of what is being said and not necessarily on what it is that you want to say. So I'll read you this quote that I think is very poignant on this. And this is a guy, his name is S.I. Hayakawa. He was actually a U.S. Senator from California. And when I read this, I thought, you got to be kidding me. A congressperson, a member of Congress in the United States actually said this about listening. He says this. He says, listening does not mean simply maintaining a polite silence while you're rehearsing in your mind the speech you're going to make the next time you can grab a conversation opening. Nor does listening mean waiting alertly for the flaws in the other person's argument so that later you can mow him or her down. Listening means trying to see the problem the way the speaker sees it, Listening requires entering actively and imaginatively into the other person's situation and trying to understand a frame of reference different than your own. I'm really bad at that. I'm not a good listener. And so I keep reminding myself of this every time I get to be part of a group discussion. Because I'm the kind of person who really likes to argue. I like to be right. Right? And so I like to get in those conversations where I have the opportunity of showing you where you're wrong and leading you into the light. Right? I want to make sure that everyone agrees with me, because if everyone thought like I did, the world would be a better place. And so, this is how we think sometimes. Right? That we are the center of the universe, and if everyone were just like us, and man, thank God we're not all the same, right? Because it's a much more interesting world that you're all not like me. So we want to be good at listening, and that means being attentive to what people are actually saying. What are the words? Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, right? Do you get it, right? That's important. The other part of listening is the nonverbal. Be paying attention to what people are actually saying. Be paying attention also to how people are saying it. Because how you say it is just as important, right? How you doing? Oh, I'm doing great. Well, that means they're probably actually doing great, right? Well, how you doing? I'm great. It's a difference, right? The same words, but there's a completely different meaning, right? So paying attention to how people are saying things is just as important. Or how people are not saying anything, right? Because they'll be sitting there, and sometimes they're sitting there in such a way that something's up, right? And so that's important. So things like facial expressions, right? Another blank, facial expressions. Their tone of voice, right? Are they being sarcastic? Or are they being sincere, right? These things are important. Their body language, right? These sort of nonverbal cues that help us to get some insight into what's going on with the group members. And being able to read that in such a way that it guides our questions, that it influences the questions, it influences the direction of the discussion, and allows us to pause in those moments where we need to pause and take care of caring for the people that are in our group. Right? We can't be so caught up in our agenda and making sure that the topic is covered and all the questions are answered that we don't take time to actually be a group that cares for one another. Right? Because sometimes the body language is such that something's up. You can take a break, have a conversation with someone before you even get started. Right? Something might come out in the middle of the discussion where you need to say, well, time out, we need to stop, put everything on hold. We had this in our group a couple times last semester. We had one lady who just in conversation was just like, yep, I found a lump in my breast and I got to go into the doctor. And we're just like shocked. You got to be, and you could tell by her nonverbal tones that she was devastated by this. And so we just said, look, time out. I don't care what we're talking about, what's going on. We need to stop and pray right now. And so we just gathered around, laid hands on her, prayed for her, did the whole thing, and nobody remembered anything else that we talked about that night but that moment. But if we weren't listening, not only to what was being said, but how it was being said, we might miss some of those opportunities to care for people. So the discussion facilitating role is not merely about just getting the questions out and making sure that there was a lively discussion, but making sure that it was a discussion that went somewhere and meant something. Okay? All right, that's all I got for you.
Yes?